This program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Inside Mojo. This is the podcast where we look back on WatchMojo's 20-year history on YouTube and break down the most pivotal moments in our evolution, as well as looking at the evolution of YouTube as a platform through our lens. I'm your host, Rob, and as always, I'm here with our CEO and co-founder, Ashkan Karbasfrooshan. What's going on, Ash?
Not much. Busy week. Good start to the year.
Have you recovered from the trauma of reliving your lawsuit in last week's episode?
Yeah, that was fine. I even realized maybe I was, I've told that story many, many times, very, very diplomatically. So admittedly, I was maybe throwing in a bit more passionate, takes, but no, it's fine. It's 20 years ago. I'm glad I went through it once, but wouldn't want to do it again, as some people say.
Very interesting story, and it leads into another interesting story, which we're going to cover this week. So I like how you said your reward for getting through that lawsuit unscathed was years of financial struggle to follow, which is what we're going to talk about today. It's WatchMojo running out of money and what happened. So take us through, what happened after you succeeded in fending off that lawsuit. Where did WatchMojo end up, and what happened in the short term after that?
Sure. I mean, to give you a financial snapshot, we were so early that there was no real revenue model. Hey, good morning, Tyler. So there was no revenue model, right? So we were making less than like $5,000 a month in terms of revenue, if that. But we had like a team and we had expenses. So we were still spending and losing tens of thousands of dollars each month. So, the injunction was May of 2006, and then the settlement took until the next year. It was just a long time of wasting energy and whatnot. But so our expenses as a virtue of investing and growing the team was going up. So I had, I've discussed this, like I basically made $250,000 from the sale and from former glory. And I mean, in 2006, it was just depleting rather quickly. And the bitter irony of settling the lawsuit was that, okay, well, what am I settling this for? Once you turn your back on the lawsuit, you're looking at, you think it's a, light at the end of the tunnel, but it's just another oncoming train, basically.
So I just want to let our audience know that we have a poll that's going up on the WatchMojo YouTube page, as well as on X, I believe. We would like to know, if your business or passion project was in jeopardy of failure, running out of money, would you mortgage your house to save it? Would you bring on a new partner in exchange for a piece of your company? Or would you just let it fail and move on to the next project? So weigh in with your thoughts on those polls, and we'll revisit that towards the end of the show. So tell me more, Ash. I understand you were looking for investors at a certain point. How did that process go, and what did that look like early on? I think we have lost Ash. He seems to be frozen.
I'm back. Do you see me?
Okay. I can hear you again.
Damn internet, but go on. I don't know. Something's going on, but anyway.
Right. I was asking you about investors. What was the process like of looking for investors, and what challenges were there for you early on?
So that's a great question. It did not help that basically I'd start a content company. I mean, the reality was, false modesty aside, most investors ultimately bet on an individual. Like, you need a team. Without a team, there's nothing. But you need a crazy person. You need the misfits, the outcasts, this as Steve Jobs coined, founders and entrepreneurs. So my challenge was that fundamentally, it wasn't like the era after Netflix and House of Cards. It definitely wasn't the era of YouTube, writing checks. It wasn't Facebook guaranteeing dollars and Instagram. Like all of this did not exist. So, investors, you really have to understand, are kind of looking for grand slam outcomes. And that's really based on, there's like a number of fundamental laws, like Moore's law. Murphy's law, these things are coined for a reason. And there is another law called power law, and power law is really in the context of investing, basically that like your one most successful portfolio company that is going to have a great outcome that return is going to be so much bigger than anything else that it'll pay for all of your other investments. It'll pay back all your investors for the, the risk that they took. And that is the case, right? So let's say if Sequoia, which has a very good record, even Sequoia, there was in one of their funds, if they invested in Google, well, that returned, 1,000 or 1,000,000 times more than any other investment. So being like a finance grad and being like a student of this racket and, just being intellectually honest, I wasn't like shocked because I thought WatchMojo, okay, was not going to be $100 billion outcome. Very few companies in content get that kind of scale. But I also viewed it maybe naively that it was such an obvious thing to do, to me at least, that it was going to be a success. But whether or not it would be the kind of success that VCs, who are very much binary, hit or miss, grand slam or nothing, long story short, it kind of like, I understood it, as frustrating as it was, being just turned down as often as I was.
What were investors looking for at that stage? Like YouTube was in its nascency.
Yeah, even when they talk content, they were actually talking more like platforms to serve content creators. So this was what I saw. I basically saw this opportunity. If this represented like content, I was like, you have Hollywood that's producing like super premium content. There's not that much inventory. It's very scarce programming. And they're making a shit ton of money online. On TV. You still think of analog dollars. There were like digital pennies at the time. So I was like, okay, common sense, MTV, ABC, Fox, these guys are not going to take their cream of the crop programming and embrace YouTube. And then if you skip the teal and green lines for a second, at the bottom, you had user-generated content, which was really like changing the rules of engagement in media. Anybody with one of these bad boys is a media company. Even then, you could see that. But at the time, that was way too erratic and low quality, so to speak. So advertisers didn't want that. So it was pretty clear that if you produce content for that middle of the market, you could build enough programming, enough views, enough, kind of economic activity. But investors did not like that because they saw in content a hits business. And they don't like that. They want to invest once, build a product, which then scales. And yeah, so the idea is when you talk about competition, competition for me, it's very different if I'm talking to employees and recruiting. I'm competing with other organizations. I got to create a great environment. With users and audiences, you're competing with the world because whether you're 60 Minutes and your bespoke in journalism or your Spielberg or your BuzzFeed or your WatchMojo or your PewDiePie or Mr. Beast, we're all competing. So that's why sometimes to some people, I'm like, well, never as an entrepreneur say we have no competition. I mean, that's a kind of moronic thing to say. If anything, you have a lot of competition. It's just who's the context. Clients very different. If we're pitching Coca-Cola, if we're pitching Netflix, yeah, I mean, all of a sudden we may be competing in an RFP with IGN and Yahoo Sports because they also have a lot of men, So you have to understand the scopes. And then with investors, the number one thing investors have, they have a ton of money. But they it's time, right? So when you invest, like I've invested in 20 startups, you're making a long-term commitment. And as an investor, you're there to coach, to guide. Sometimes you don't even have any contact. But so for me, I could understand that, okay, these guys want to make 10 bets over the course of, let's say, 3 years, like the life of the lifespan of their fund. And they're willing for 9 out of 10 of their bets to go to zero, for one to be like $100 billion exit, so that if they own 2% of that at exit, they make $2 billion, which makes up the $1 billion fund that they had. And I was realistic. I knew that WatchMojo would be really successful, but it wouldn't be like some people are like, you still work? You must be a billionaire. I'm like, first of all, I like my work, but no, like WatchMojo is a success, but content companies are just not technology. They don't have the same scale. They don't necessarily command the same multiples and valuations. You could build a really, really successful business as we did, but I like content. This was my ultimate sin. I just really loved storytelling.
So one big investment that you as founder have to make is employees, talent. Tell me about that. What do you look for in employees? How pivotal was that in growing WatchMojo from the ground up?
Well, I mean, look, I don't like to quote warmongers like Donald Rumsfeld, but he goes, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. So yeah, like in general, when you talk to, the most successful of VCs, they're always like set up in the Bay Area in San Fran, because that's where you have a lot of engineering talent, a lot of programmers. I love San Francisco, but I would never want to live in San Francisco. LA would have been interesting, but I was like, I'm not going to go set up in LA. In 2006, it was still very much Hollywood. It would have made no sense. New York made some sense, in terms of the capital of the world for media and all that. But I was in Montreal, and I was like, you know what? Before I get ahead of myself and build like the commerce side, the commercial deals and partnerships, you got to build it. You got to build it. You got to create the catalog. And I basically was hiring young creators who in the backdrop were being told that journalism was a waste of a degree and English was a waste of a degree and liberal arts were for losers. And I was like, no. I'm like, it's a degree. It's a skill. You have to apply it to something. So yeah, like I actually, because I was a jack of all trades, master of none, I was hiring people that really cared about the content. I was hiring people that maybe most entrepreneurs would not want to deal with, whether it was like journalism students or English grads or liberal arts, people that like could look and research and pay, create content that was, worthy of the time of the audience, no matter how crappy content was at the time. So I always was rather contrarian and, zigged when others zagged. So because I was building a content company, I was basically hiring out of Montreal. And admittedly, I was recruiting people who all had a chip on their shoulders, or there was something about each one that I was like, okay, I'll be able to activate this person and really get them to kind of become really the best version of themselves. And frankly, as cheesy as it sounds, a version of them that they don't even know they can. And that's what a good coach does. A good leader is you basically the sum of the parts. I know what I'm good at, I know what I'm bad at, etc. And I could kind of pick. And that's the thing. You meet people early on, and some bosses, they focus on the bad. Okay, we get it. Some guy isn't good at this, some gal's not good at that. Don't build around that weakness. Build around their strengths. So it's common sense, but just it worked, but it was a very long-term project, so to speak.
In your book, The 10-Year Overnight Success, you talk about this endless chase and the shift to the creator economy, which I imagine played a big role in WatchMojo's development. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think fundamentally the way I looked at things when I would talk to VCs, and I'm not one, like, same thing I've said about lawyers, there's good and bad in everything. I really fundamentally believe that like what is sustainable doesn't scale overnight, and what is scalable, it takes time. Like you really have to kind of chase quality partnerships, quality revenue, as they say, and you can't arbitrage your way to BS. So for us, I kind of always saw VCs a bit as like paper tigers, if you want to call them, like a lot of talk about finding companies that are built to last, but they would be chasing every fad. If all of a sudden somebody was launching, Crapster, the fart app, all of a sudden they were like, well, what is our fart app strategy? And I would be like, really? Like, so I saw every fad come and go. So for us, it was really just like the irony was, as much as that you have to be impatient, you have to be like, something has to bother you as an entrepreneur, you also have to be really, really patient, both with your strategy, with your people. And that's one reason why I actually think at 46, I would probably never start a company myself. Because it's really, really, really kind of taking a very long-term approach. Even there's an expression, being long-term greedy, like really like skating to where the puck is going to go and not necessarily seeing the market today. And this was a bit of a frustration of mine with VCs that, they kind of lack that long-term vision. They kind of lack that common sense. It was really, they were just like, oh, this fund down the street is doing this, so we have to do it and make more noise, essentially.
So WatchMojo is going through this incredibly rough patch. How much did you personally have to invest in the company in order to stimulate it to
So, I mean, my idea really thought that I was going to raise money. I thought I'd raise like $500,000, which at the time was like a reasonable amount to start. But I basically started to cover the costs. And before I knew it, I was in about $250,000 in terms of cash, savings. Look, $250,000 is both a fortune and nothing. Right now you do see some funds that some startups that start and they have like 5 million, 10 million, some 50 million, again, depending on what you're building. But to me, 250 was actually not insignificant. But we were going up against companies that had raised 5, 10, 15, some of them at the time, $45 million. And this is some random slide. I put $1 million because I didn't want WatchMojo to look small, but it was effectively 250 of cash, savings, stock, whatever, just all of it, not fun. And then when I ran out of money, well, I could shut down, which didn't really seem like a good idea. That's when I actually then went into debt and basically went through an additional $500,000. In the end, like the tail of the tape, our accumulated losses over the first few years hit about 898,000 Canadian. So again, ungodly sums of money depending on the context. But as a guy that studied this stuff, I was like, that's nothing, because I knew our competitors in the US were going through $5-10 million just making stupid decisions upon stupid decisions,
So you had complete confidence that this would pay off in the end. There was no doubt in your mind.
Okay, let's hold on. Were there moments when I would wake up and probably in the fetal position be like, what the fuck did I do? Yes, obviously. I felt like it was 1916. I'm in the French-German, border conflict in World War I in a trench and just being shot at and going, I'm going to die here in this hole. Like, let's just not lose sight of that. But when I took a step back, when I breathed, when I relaxed, when I kind of meditated or whatever, I was like, wait a minute. It's not like I'm holding on to some print magazine that nobody reads, but I love the art of a print. It's like the internet, video, mobile, YouTube, online advertising. And we were building an evergreen catalog. And also every other week, we had some big or small media company saying, we love what you're doing. We get this is the future. We can't do it. Can we invest or buy? So I had enough. Like I always tell entrepreneurs sometimes, I'm like, well, what is the end game here for you? Like you're 3 years wandering the desert. I'm a master of that, but I could see enough metrics where objectively I could be like, okay, I don't know when, but this will succeed, right? So I'm not telling people to have blind faith either.
It's a lot of personal sacrifice to make. And was there a low point for you in terms of like having to make sacrifice that you maybe weren't prepared to make? Or
yeah. Well, I mean, this is more just like what this slide is when you're talking to parties. This is something I've shared when I was teaching at McGill, and I send this to all my entrepreneurs that I help. I'm like, just when somebody approaches you, understand that there's really 3 big phases: interest, intent, and action. So we would get people interested, kicking tires. A lot of them, and this is fine, were picking my brains because they wanted to go invest in something else, not even content. They wanted to understand, okay, how does the media content entrepreneur who might be a client of this technology we're going to invest in? So a lot of it I could sense was that, but it's business is about relationships. So I didn't mind, opening up, so to speak. But ultimately, very few, I spoke to 100, I got turned down by 100 VCs. Very few were moving to intent and even less to action. But to your question, the low point, and I wrote about this in the 10-year overnight success when I was kind of recapping. So like in 2016, I think Mark Zuckerberg, to his credit, him and his wife, she had a miscarriage and he publicized it, and it was good. It was good to raise awareness. So I had, my spouse and I, who's one of the co-founders, she experienced that as well. And with her blessing a decade ago, I alluded to it. And yeah, so July 1st of 2007, it was kind of like we were excited. Like while we had this WatchMojo project, we had this other project that we were looking forward to. And I learned that, yeah, like 30% of women in their first pregnancy do experience that, but few talk about it. And it was just this whole other like layer of stress and, just bad stuff. But that's life, like I know a lot of people in the last decade are like, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm like, do you understand what you're signing up for? Like, forget professionally, forget personally, but that professional and personal blender that you're about to go through for a decade. I'm like, you have to understand you need a lot of resiliency. You need a lot of, just tough, thick skin, just toughness that is, manifested in ways your colleagues don't even know. That day, I still had a colleague complaining about something. I had probably a lawsuit still, but it's just part of life. And, it is what it is.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. My wife also dealt with a miscarriage in between our first and second kids. So I definitely feel you on that. Not an easy thing to go through.
You feel guilty when you're like, you learn about, the way the body is and all that. And you kind of, come around to see it, as a, not a positive, but you understand how, the body and science works. But nonetheless, it sucks, and you have all this hardship at work, and then you get that. It was a particularly dark, lonely time.
Yeah, no
That's
doubt.
funny, by the way, one guy who I won't name, it's not a bad thing. He was actually one of those that was like interested. He actually had invested in content companies. He was actually an investor in GameSpot, IGN competitor.
Yeah.
So he knew content. And when I was like, sorry for following up, I've been dealing with some personal stuff. And when I told him, he's like, oh, it's cool. I've moved on, not interested in investing anymore, which is here.
Nice.
But he's like, oh, like my wife also went through it, we'll share horror stories once. So I was like, okay, just thank you,
You can relate on some level.
What do you say to that?
Yeah. So you mentioned having pitched to 100 investors. How many of them just straight up said no to you? And were there any that showed any interest?
No, yeah, we had like over 100 no's, but to be fair, so this is one anecdotal, because this guy, I ended up investing in his project after. So we had, I would say, maybe 5 to 10 that were like not just interest, but intent. I don't really think we ever had like a term sheet from a VC, because very quickly I could see like this isn't going to work. But we did have like 2 or 3. Ironically, one was like, there was this software entrepreneur who was looking for his next kind of opportunity named Lauren. And like, he reached out to me and we actually became friends. And once in New York, we happened to be in the city together. And he's like, hey, let's meet up at a wings place. I was like, sure, I like chicken wings. And I realized he suggested Hooters. And I was like, you call Hooters the wings place? I'm like, I would call Hooters something else. It's like the tractor story in Seinfeld. But what's funny is then years later, even though he turned me down and a VC that he introduced me to passed when he wasn't interested, I invested in his company because I was like, I love restaurants, I love food, I like him. So I was like, why not? But it was a bit like I was thinking back, subconsciously, I'm like, am I investing like for just because like he passed? So I'm trying to, again, like humans are weird, but so we had 2 or 3. And even when I wrote the book and I alluded to all these, it wasn't before, it was before, because I mentioned this in the book. There was a Montreal-based investor, John Stokes. To his credit, he actually had worked in media. So when he set up Real Ventures here, which was kind of pioneering, I mean, they did help change the composition of VC in Montreal. He verbally offered us a $400,000 investment at an $800,000 pre-money valuation for like a third of the business. And it wasn't the money. It was just more, there was a few other terms that we didn't see eye to eye. And I remember vividly like meeting in between where he had his office and I had my office on the main, and a coffee shop. And it just didn't make sense. So he was like, you keep saying nobody offered you something. He's like, I like to point out that I saw what you were building, but never with the VCs, nothing ever serious, because also I didn't want to build a bullshit content farm. I'll be honest with you. And like a lot of these conversations were happening when like demand media was getting a lot of write-ups and they were just producing like content farm. And this was what they were proud of. And I was like, no. I was like, you have to, like, the content has to be good. It's like, yes, there is a volume need in online. You do need certain frequency if you want to be successful. But it's all relative, right? And I think I was a bit, even though a lot of VC said it's good that you're like right brain and left brain, like you're creative, but you could read a P&L, you get all this. I was a bit more of like a content guy, a story guy. Then I think, I could have been if I would have brought on an investor who would have, frankly, there was another scenario that was funny. Bo Peabody, who was the founder of Tripod or GeoCities, either or, like one of the earliest social networks. I read one time an article that he was looking for content, and this was like 2008 or 9. So I was like shocked. I'm like, an investor who's looking for content. And I met him a few times, but he wanted us to pivot WatchMojo right before we focused on top 10s and like geek culture and pop culture and fandom. He wanted us to go down style and beauty, obviously. But long story short, I was like, I don't think that makes sense for us. I'm like, the world is going, the world is going forward where everybody with a phone is going to be creating really good like tips and whatever. And I knew that we could not really compete with the universe in food, beauty, and style. And I think to really succeed, this era of like storyteller, what YouTube has done to emancipate creators, is you do need a bit of a balance. You know, you got to be able to tell a story. Nobody says you need to balance your books and be a CPA at night, like at all. Hire the pros, but you do have to understand like administration. You need to understand taxes. The other day on my timeline, some gamer, some guy was like crying that the IRS took his money. Like, yo, bitch, wake up there. You know, it's like, this is part of life. Like, I love all you guys. We hire you in droves from like Concordia's journalism. You guys are so lost about taxes, and not saying you guys, but
they don't teach us that in school. Like, this is one thing I don't understand.
They're like, come teach, come help us, like guide students. I'm like, it's the more pedestrian taxes, invoicing. Like, we have to, like, part of our training is this is a template. It's Excel or Google Sheets. This is an invoice. Like, I'm like, what are you doing? What are you training these people for? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're going a bit on that, but you do need to have a bit of, and a lot of our success was because I knew accounting. It sounds boring. I understood, like, oh, you got the tax, you know, like even like when we got audited, the government was like, you're so clean as a whistle. You know, we had like pay equity, and the consultant was like, you guys are pretty, you know, reasonable, and you have good benchmarks and everything. So, and this is a mistake. Like my main frustration investing in other entrepreneurs is being Switzerland between their stupid ass VCs who are all doing their job, fiduciary duty to their LPs, which means they'll jam a screwdriver in your kneecap if it suits them. And then the entrepreneurs who all think they're Steve Jobs. You know, like I'm there winning an award from EY. I'm like, humble, I'm sorry, we don't know anything. Teach me, wise people. And now you get entrepreneurs that can't even tie their shoelace, and they're like Steve Jobs, you know? So it's kind of like, it's like everybody is, instead of being more like, wow, there's a lot I don't know, I realized this whole generation is know-it-all, you know, factory, so to speak. So, yeah. But now we're going really on other tangents. But that's the thing.
There's got to be an element of like fake it till you make it with some of these people too, right?
Look, I do think that there's way too much BS in like getting a story on TechCrunch and like, you know, again, sell on. There's a saying: sell on rumor, buy on news, or whatever, or it's getting old, but you get it, right?
I get it.
I personally have never believed in that bullshit. Like a word people use often to describe me as transparent. It works for me because I don't have time to keep track of lies. And, you know, I think information is important when it's shared and its experiences, yada, yada. Yeah, I do think there's definitely that when it comes to entrepreneurship, to fake it till you make it. But I also think we live in a world of authenticity. We live in a world of transparency. Everything is a click away. The truth comes out. So, you know, and look, at the end of the day, I never raised money from VC. So maybe it's because I was honest. I didn't lie to them. But I do feel that, like, you don't want to waste people's time. Like, if somebody comes to me, I always tell them, I go, what's the worst thing? Tell me. Like, what's the thing that I should pay attention to then turn towards coming some kind of agreement. Don't surprise me at the 11th hour, you know? So yeah, maybe to some extent. What I like more is project a bigger shadow. You know, like one thing we did is by writing articles for like Media Post and TechCrunch, even when WatchMojo was tiny, you know, conferences would roll out the red carpet and I'd be sitting there on stage interviewing like the head of whatever at Disney or like the head of some fund. And that was because of writing, but it wasn't faking it. It was just finding ways to push and punch above your weight, that is critical. That is essential.
We've got a question from the audience, I believe. You say you are more of a creative guy. So what skills did you have to develop to move forward?
I mean, for me, it was really quickly hiring people that I didn't have an expertise. I do believe in this comparative advantage, principle of specialization, mumbo jumbo, Freud. Like, I don't know who Floyd is, but he's a fascinating
hybrid.
Yeah, no. So for me, very quickly, I would hire people to like cover my weaknesses. So like I've never been a video editor, surprising to some maybe, given what WatchMojo does. It made no sense. I recorded one time in the first year, one thing, they never used it. It was just so bad, you know, like it's not my skill set. So for me, it wasn't, you know, I won't lie, I'm pretty darn good at the things that I'm somewhat knowledgeable at, but the things that I'm really not good at, like I can't paint, I could cook, you know, so I would invest to learn to be a better cook, but I don't believe that I'm going to go become a painter because it just sucks. I'm not a painter. You know, so my thing is double down on your strengths, understand things you don't know, but that's where you bring on other people's expertise. Right, don't be like cheap. Don't be like, oh, I'm going to learn to video edit because I don't want to hire somebody to video edit for me. That's like moronic.
So getting back to the topic of VCs, ultimately, do you think that they were wrong to pass up on WatchMojo? And additionally, you think how many of them do you think were kicking themselves years later
I
after
did
seeing
have a
value?
lot who were like, I always believed in you, buddy, when they were like, good luck with that business, pal. So no, look, I honestly, again, maybe last week I had put some, I don't know, mustard in my coffee and I was a bit more raw. I don't think VCs were wrong because even if we're, for example, worth valued, not revenue, valued at 100 million one day, 200 million, those are still small outcomes to VCs. That's the crazy batshit part, right? So if the VC theory around power law is that they wanted one thing within 5 years, because don't forget, for 6 years we lost money, then I don't necessarily think they were wrong, but because of the nature of VC. But I also think that, it doesn't help when you do think the world is against you. You do think you're alone. And as an entrepreneur, you do have this complex, it literally is, where you think you're alone and you think like the world is out not to get you, or at least not to necessarily help you, when VCs are ultimately trying to put money to play, right? So maybe subconsciously I wasn't comfortable, because I had certain principles and I was pretty patient in what I wanted to build. But no, I do get some who come to me and say they regret not investing, but I actually, given what I know about the VC racket now, I think it makes sense. We're a very successful company. My investment, that $250,000, for what it turned into, is probably, again, I study this stuff, is probably one of the best returns on investment in startup history and probably media history, like history. If you take all the investments in companies, but is it still enough for somebody managing like $1 billion fund? Yeah, I don't know. And to each their own.
You've referenced in the past about being Iranian, Canadian, a Muslim, a background. Not suggesting that that played into the reasons for rejection, but was that in the back of your mind as you were kind of pitching?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I wrote about this. I mean, you have to also bear in mind, I started my career after 9/11, even though I was secular, Western, atheist, agnostic. And I grew up like in a lot of like Jewish area neighborhoods. Like if you know Montreal, like I grew up in Snowden, which is right next to Hampstead and Côte Saint Luc, or when I lived in Westmount. And, so I work in media where there is a high degree of representation, so I was always, it was weird for me because growing up, I was totally not Muslim. I was as Canadian as they come. I've joked, I brought up on bacon, beers, and babes type of thing. But I did have this insecurity after 9/11 that I was like, oh, people, like when I went to Australia, even though not a single one of the hijackers on 9/11 was Iranian. When I went to Australia, it was as part of media. One of the fans who came with us, we followed the Honda. We went to the Honda Indy kart racing car final there. And one of the winners was like a citizen. And as we're drinking and having fun one night, he's like, oh, and this was right after 9/11. And he was like, oh, at first when I saw you get on the plane, I was like, is he one of those guys? I was like, what the fuck? And he said this to me. And I was like, this is just how some people think. So I do think that I had this insecurity. When I left Ask Men, and I refer to this in my book, there were 3 guys that wanted me to join them. Now, I was not interested in joining any company. And it was 3 Jewish gentlemen. And one of them, the more senior guy, he was like, what do you think of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, like who was at the time president of Iran? And I was like, well, whatever. He said some batshit crazy thing. And because I also never want to insult anybody, even if I disagree with them, I kind of said, well, I think this is what he meant, but I don't agree with it. But I remember going, well, if this gentleman is asking this, this will always be there. But as I grew older, I was like, yeah, you know what? And October 7th showed it. Jewish people have their own freaking fish to fry. They're not sitting there in a room conspiring against Ashkan Karbasfrooshan. So I recognize that, yeah, probably, it's not like discrimination. I definitely don't think I've ever, same way no U.S. Customs Guard, I have a Canadian passport, has ever once given me a hard time for being born in Iran. I don't think in my 25 years in media, 20 years in media, I could really say there was one time when I actually saw or faced discrimination. But I definitely know that it was like an insecurity. And that's the thing. Like I understand why some people say what they do about, Jewish people in the media because of just the representation. But to me, that's more of a lack of understanding of history than anything else, But absolutely, it was something totally on the back of my mind. Facts.
I think we have our poll results ready, so we can pull those up if we have them and check out what people said. Just to review, we asked what you would do if your passion project or business was facing failure. Would you mortgage your house, bring on new partners, or let it fail and move on to the next thing? I'm very curious to see what people have said about this. It seems that 50% said they would sell a piece of their business to partners. 31% said let it fail, and only 15% said mortgage your house. So you are really in the minority there, Ash, with your big actions.
I mean, that is called the sane, smart way to do things. You know, the reality is, in those dark early years, I remember, like, I couldn't give equity away. Like, I couldn't. You know, like, people were just not interested. They were investing in everything around me. Most of which I didn't understand, and most of which failed because of power law, not because we're so special. But it was hard, and it reminded me of Russell Simmons. Not that he's not flawed in many other ways, but Russell Simmons, who started Def Jam, he was like, in the end, he's like, I ended up being more successful financially because nobody wanted to partner with me. And in my case, I don't think it's that nobody wanted to partner with me or nobody saw WatchMojo. It was just the confluence of building a business, media, content, video on YouTube, relying on fair use, us being in Montreal. Like, we had enough X's next to our profile, but this is pretty representative, I think.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, I think that pretty much does it for this week's episode, unless you have anything else to address, Ash. Maybe you want to give a little preview of what's to come on next week's episode, which will be about finding the product/market or the best platform and fit for your content.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important in the context of, again, YouTube and the WatchMojo origins to say that, like, it's no longer 2006, right? Like, the opportunities for venture funding have dramatically changed for entrepreneurs, but the fundamentals of VCs have not. So I do think next week we'll talk a little bit about entrepreneurs, storytellers. I get a lot of people emailing me saying I'm looking for funding to start something like the next WatchMojo. And so, yeah, I mean, you have to balance what I think I had to experience. And I had, like, the fortune and misfortune of doing it my way. But I think entrepreneurs and storytellers really, really have to balance what they can say or do to get funding, which means giving up a little bit on their vision, their principles and all that, versus holding out and the toll it might take. But then in the end, you do build the product or the company or the story that you want. It's a trade-off. And we'll discuss all that next week some more.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Thank you very much, everybody who watched live. This will be up on our YouTube channel as well. I just want to remind everybody that we have previous episodes that you can check out on the WatchMojo YouTube channel, as well as on Spotify. So there's a variety of places where you can see this podcast, and we'll be back again next week with more Inside Mojo for you to enjoy. Thanks, everybody.